Hey, how's it going, y'all? So today I'm going to go through and talk about a topic that has a very influential impact on American society, which is the Korean War and the Vietnam War, right? So the Korean War and the Vietnam War were two major events during the 1900s that showed how different wars could look like compared to, wars like World War II, right? Most soldiers in the Korean War and Vietnam War, they wore like clear and identifiable uniforms, right? Because they belonged to like national armies, right? And especially back in like World War I, World War II, those wars were fought like on set battlefields, right? They were very obvious this was gonna be like a battlefield. They're gonna fight here, This made it easier to identify who was on each side, right? But in the Korean War, which began in the year 1950, right, which is right after World War II, considering World War II ended in 1945, the Korean Peninsula, right, became divided into North Korea and South Korea. The North had support from the Soviet Union and China, while the South was supported by the United States and also the United Nations, which was an organization between multiple different like cities, states, all these places supported the United Nations, and countries were a part of it. They were like, they belonged to it, just like people belong to a football team, right? Countries belong to the United Nations, right? But unlike World War II, the situation in like North Korea and like South Korea and whatnot, and the division between both of them was not always clear or straightforward, right? Because during this war, some opponents did not always wear traditional uniforms. Instead, they blended into towns, villages, and different cities. Whatnot. They looked just like the average citizen there, right? This made it harder to know who was on like which side. The Korean War basically ended with a draw, which meaning nobody like won or lost the war, right? The Vietnam War, on the other hand, which lasted from the 1950s all the way to the 1970s, right, had similar challenges. In Vietnam, the United States and its allies supported South Vietnam, right? And while North Vietnam and its allies worked to unite the country under one government, many of the opponents in Vietnam did not fight in the same way as armies in World War II did, right? They often used the land around them, forests, rice fields, and villages, to blend in with the local population, right? Because they did not always wear like recognizable uniforms during this war, it was difficult to separate everyday people from those who were fighting. You didn't know if these people were active combatants or they were just normal civilians. So people had to get them to be very, very careful, right? Because of this issue, this changed how like this war is understood and remembered, and it affected how wars after it were fought. People, this kind of trend, didn't just stay in Vietnam; it went to wars well in the future, right? The Vietnam War was a struggle in Asia that stretched across many years, right? It was not like the big wars before it, because instead of two sides lining up with like clear armies and uniforms, right, this war was harder to see and identify. North Vietnam really went to war because they wanted to bring the whole country together under its system. It was like a communist system, right? And the South Vietnam, they had help from the U.S. and other countries who wanted to stop that from happening. They wanted to go through and unify it like in a democracy, right? It was really like a contest between democracy, which was like the U.S.'s system of government, right, and the communist system, right? That was like Russia, right? And so it was really escalated and showcased the division and the conflict that ensued, in Vietnam. What made Vietnam different was how the fighting looked, right? People in Vietnam, they had various groups that supported them, and these different groups, they would blend into towns and villages, right? And they used the thick jungles and the rice fields like to their advantage during the war. Because of this, the U.S. and South Vietnam often had a hard time telling who was on which side, right? If they were just a civilian, if they were actually fighting, right? So in the end, the war left behind like many lessons that all the countries involved, both the communist side and and the democracy, South Vietnam and whatnot, that these people had to learn, these countries had to learn, right? Because Vietnam ultimately was a defeat for the U.S. and its allies. They gave up trying to go through and pursue it, and they let South Vietnam take over the war themselves. And unfortunately, without the support from the U.S. and its allies, South Vietnam would eventually fall, and it would become just Vietnam, right? Vietnam underneath the communist leadership. For Vietnam, it changed the way the country was governed. For the U.S., it led to a big debates at home about whether the country should be involved in long and unclear wars, right? These are the lessons they learned, right? The Vietnam really showed that not every conflict was fought the same way, and sometimes the setting and the strategies make it very difficult and different to go through and handle the shifting and ever-moving conflict in a new modern day and style war, right? These course had impacts that still impact us today, right? Those things. This also led to new ways of thinking about like international conflict, alliances, and the importance of like cultural understanding how, you know, everybody has different ways of thinking, and respect and tolerance is a very key part that, you know, has been spread around the world. We're trying to still spread and understand that, you know, we can respect and love everybody, right? These wars remind us that not all conflicts like look the same, right? That history can teach us many different lessons, right? So basically, I want to go through one real quick like summary of it. So like in conclusion, you know, World War II was different, and it led to these new types of wars after World War II. World War II was a very, very different war, unlike any the world had ever seen, and that just changed the way wars were fought. That's demonstrated, like, you know, in the Korean and Vietnam War. Like Korea, you know, people they had like uniformed soldiers, and in Vietnam it was really not the same way, right? You know, the Korean War began in 1950. North Korea was supported by the Soviet Union and China, while South Korea was supported by the U.S. and the UN, you know, United Nations. One challenge in the Korean War was that opponents didn't always like wear like traditional uniforms, although that was not nearly as seen as much as it was in Vietnam. So I want to keep that distinction very much relevant. You know, it's very relevant. You know, opponents in both wars used like features like forests, rice fields, and villages to blend in. And this was also seen even more in Vietnam, right? Because, you know, South Vietnam was supported by the U.S. and its allies, and, you know, North Vietnam was supported by, you know, like communists, you know, like the communists in different countries like China, Russia, whatever, right? And ultimately, these showed us that not all wars will look the same, and even in the future, if there are other conflicts in the future, I doubt very seriously they'll look anything like ones in the past, because a war and everyone's kind of stuff always evolves and things change. Things are no longer the same as what they were in the past. So, you know, ultimately, there are challenges and lessons that can be learned to help go through and better the world for good and for peace. So thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed. I hope you have a wonderful day.